Hey guys, tonight we slip into the creaky world of wooden gears and whispering sacks, where flour drifts like ghostly fog across old stone floors, and a few fingers always seem to come away heavier than they should. You're walking a rutted path, boot soles caked in spring mud, grain sacks slung over your shoulder. You're headed for the village mill, a hulking beast of a place with a groaning water wheel and a reputation for light flour and heavy hands. You've heard the rumors everyone has. The miller takes more than he should. But what choice do you have? And, let's be honest, you probably won't survive this century without some bread in your belly, even if it comes with a side of resentment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where in the world this sleepy little corner reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the hedgerows, the wind tugging at your cloak, as the squat outline of the mill looms ahead. From a distance, it almost looks peaceful, just a sturdy, timber-framed structure crouched beside a burbling stream. But everyone in the village knows that's not the whole story. The mill is more than a machine for grinding grain. It's a place of quiet manipulation, subtle theft, and dusty deception. You step into the mill and instantly feel the texture of flour in the air. Soft, choking, clinging to your nose and lashes. You cough politely. No one ever breathes normally in here. The smell is yeasty, heavy, and slightly sour, like bread dough left to ferment too long. You squint through the dust, and there he is, the miller. His sleeves are rolled up, his forearms like tree trunks, and his smirk could curdle milk. He greets you like an old friend. You're not friends. Still, you need him. Medieval society ran on grain. Not gold, not glory, grain. It was the daily fuel for peasants, merchants, priests, and lords. And that grain needed to be milled. So, like everyone else, you brought your harvest to the miller, who ground it into flour for a price. That price was called the miller's toll, usually a legally defined portion of your grain. Sounds fair in theory. In practice, not so much. Because here's the thing, millers knew the system inside and out. They knew how to angle the scoop just right to accidentally collect more grain. They knew that no one was going to weigh the flour on the way out. Not properly. And they knew, perhaps most importantly, that you had nowhere else to go. Your village is small. Maybe a few dozen families. Maybe 100 people if you count the babies and the goats. There's only one mill, and it belongs to the Lord. Yes, the feudal cherry on top. You're technically required to use this specific mill. You can't take your grain elsewhere. You can't set up a hand mill at home, not without breaking the law. That would be soak. The Lord's right to control the milling of grain within his domain. Break it and you could be fined, flogged, or worse, depending on how grumpy the bailiff is feeling. So you accept it. You go through the motions. You tip your sack toward the bin, trying not to notice how much dust flies up. You pretend not to see the miller's hand linger in the trough just a second too long. And yet, there's always that moment, the pause when he weighs the flour. Not in front of you, of course. That would be too honest. No, he disappears behind the grinding room's curtain, just for a few minutes. You hear the rumble of the millstones slow, the groan of wood on wood as he fiddles with something unseen. Then he reappears, sack in hand, smiling just a little too wide. "Here you go," he says. "Good strong flour, finest grind. Should bake up lovely." You nod. You thank him. But when you leave, the sack feels just a little too light. And you wonder. Historians still argue whether the average medieval miller was truly a thief, or just deeply resented for standing between peasant and bread. After all, the legal tolls were often generous by today's standards. A tenth, a twelfth, even a 16th of your grain might go into his hands, fair and square. But then again, medieval peasants were obsessive record keepers when it came to food. Complaints about millers stretch across centuries, languages, and countries. So maybe they weren't imagining it. One fringe account tells of a miller in 13th century Flanders who kept 2 flour bins, one for customers, and a secret one beneath the floorboards for his personal stash. It was discovered only when a wandering dog fell through a rotten plank and landed in the secret compartment, barking indignantly. The villagers laughed for weeks. The miller? He vanished overnight. Back in your village, stories like that linger like flour dust. You hear them in whispers at the tavern, or murmured while hoeing rows of beans. But no one ever confronts the miller directly. He's too important, too protected, and besides, he has dirt on everyone. You remember the old rhyme children sing in the fields. The miller's hand is soft and white slash from flour stolen in the night. You'd laugh, but your stomach is too empty for jokes. Outside, the wheel groans as it turns. Water spills over the lip, driving the mill's innards with ancient force. It's oddly hypnotic. You imagine what it would feel like to toss the grain yourself, to lift the millstone, to see every cog and chute and lever with your own eyes. But that kind of access is not for you. The mill is part sacred space, part fortress. Ordinary villagers stay in the front room, just far enough to smell the flour, never close enough to see the truth. Still, you watch, you learn, you notice. One day, maybe you'll be the one standing behind the bin, sleeves rolled up, smirk firmly in place. And when you do, you'll remember every trick the last miller pulled. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get away with 1 or 2 of your own. You keep your flour sack close on the walk home, even though you know it won't change what's inside. The weight still feels wrong, and you find yourself wondering, not for the first time, if that miller is somehow getting richer off your bread crusts. But here's the twist. As much as you want to call him a swindler, deep down you know the truth. You need him. That's the strange paradox of the medieval miller. He's indispensable and utterly despised. Everyone eats bread. Everyone needs flour. And unless you've got a personal donkey-powered cornstone in your hut, unlikely, or you're lucky enough to live by a monastery that lets folks use their mills, extremely unlikely. Your grain passes through the hands of the miller. He is the middleman of necessity, the human bottleneck in the great agricultural machine. And oh boy, does he act like it. He stands apart, sometimes quite literally. His house is often just up the hill from the mill, in clear view of everyone but somehow never within earshot when complaints start flying. He dresses a little finer, talks a little louder, and always seems to be chewing on something, like a man with the luxury of excess grain. You've seen him with pie. Pie! People mutter, but no one openly challenges him. Even when flour comes back looking suspiciously gray, or when a whole sack seems to vanish in the time it takes for the millstones to hum through their song. Why? Because the miller isn't just working for himself. He's working for the Lord. Most medieval mills were not privately owned by humble craftsmen with dreams of fair business. They were controlled by local manors, monasteries, or noble estates. That meant the miller was an agent of the ruling power, and often a well-protected one at that. If you accused him of stealing, you weren't just calling out a bad neighbor. You were accusing a representative of the system itself. Bold move. There's an old English folk tale about a miller who got too cocky and demanded extra grain from every woman who came to the mill. One day, a clever widow switched her wheat with dried mustard seeds, which gummed up the millstones and turned the flour a bitter, choking yellow. The tale ends with her laughing and the miller spitting mustard for a week. Real life? Probably not. But the story survives because it hits a nerve. People dreamed of tricking the trickster. And make no mistake, the miller was seen as a trickster. Even in popular medieval literature, he's rarely portrayed with sympathy. Think of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The miller is a red-faced drunk who steals corn, tells dirty jokes, and insults everyone around him. The depiction wasn't a fluke, it was a mirror. Miller stereotypes were baked into medieval consciousness. Red hair, sweaty face, wide girth, and a loud voice? Classic Miller. Always working, always eating, always just a little too slick with the numbers. Some chroniclers even joked that millers carried two ledgers, one for the Lord, one for the truth. The resentment ran so deep that it occasionally boiled over. There are records of villages banding together to complain about millers, accusing them of tampering with toll measures, using uneven weights, or, my personal favorite, letting the flour settle undisturbed, so the portion shrinks by subtle means. Translation: the flour was fluffy and full in the scoop, but by the time you got home, it had deflated, like medieval cereal boxes. And then there's the curious case of millers and festivals. In some villages, during seasonal celebrations, locals would stage mock trials or parades where someone dressed up as the miller, usually with exaggerated belly and padded pouches, and was symbolically punished, dunked in water, or made to confess ridiculous crimes. It was all in good fun, of course. Sort of. These performances were more than comic relief. They were public venting, ritualized complaint. Because in truth, few dared to oppose the real miller to his face. You might as well shake your fist at the tax collector or the weather. Historians still argue whether millers really were disproportionately dishonest, or if they just bore the brunt of a system that forced dependence on a single, unlovable profession. After all, their work was hard, loud, and dangerous. They maintained heavy wooden equipment, wrangled animals, braved floods and droughts, and were always covered in flour. They were tradesmen, yes, but also engineers, mechanics, and occasionally diplomats. A mainstream historical fact? Here's one. In many parts of medieval Europe, the position of miller was hereditary. That's right, families passed down the trade like a family heirloom. So if you were born to a miller, odds were high you'd die with flour under your nails. It also meant that reputations, good or bad, tended to stick for generations. Which brings us to a quirkier tidbit. Some communities believed that millers could control the outcome of harvests with a well-timed curse or blessing. Sounds absurd now, but back then, people were desperate to explain bad luck. If your wheat spoiled or your bread turned to stone, maybe it wasn't just poor storage. Maybe the miller had looked at you funny. There are records, real ones, of peasants offering gifts not just to the church, but to the miller hoping for a better grind. A little honey, a bit of cheese, flattery, bribes if we're being honest, because a slightly kinder miller could mean a slightly fuller stomach. It's all part of the uneasy dance. You despise him, but you need him. He knows this. He banks on it. And every time you hand over your grain, he smiles that smug little smile. The one that says, "I've done this 1,000 times, and I'll do it 1,000 more. But next time you tell yourself you'll watch a little closer. Maybe linger longer. Maybe catch him in the act." Of course, even if you do, what then? Because here's the thing about medieval life. It's rarely about justice. It's about survival. And for as long as the grain needs grinding, the miller stays right where he is, dusty, smug, and unavoidable. You lean in closer now, eyes narrowing as the miller prepares to fill your sack. It's time to see just how the creative measuring actually happens. You probably think it's all bluff and brawn, but there's a surprising artistry to it. A sleight of hand dance played out in the dusty half-light of the mill. First off, forget what you know about scales and honesty. The medieval miller isn't going to set your grain on a precise balance. Instead, the story is all about the scoop. Yes, that humble wooden scoop, worn smooth by years of use and perhaps just a bit wider than it should be. It's not just the size that matters, it's how the scoop is used. The miller knows how to tilt it just so, packing grain in uneven layers or letting some slip away. A quick flick of the wrist can make a difference between a full measure and a light one. You can almost see the grains shimmying in the scoop like nervous dancers. One popular trick was called heaping the scoop. Instead of leveling off the grain evenly, the miller would heap a pile in the scoop, then pretend to shake off the excess, except the shake was more of a gentle tap, leaving a slight mound. It doesn't seem like much, but over dozens of sacks, that small pile adds up. You're probably imagining a shifty character with darting eyes doing all this in the blink of an eye. Sometimes yes, but often the miller was surprisingly casual about it. The act of skimming grain was so routine, it almost felt like a rite of passage. Like a magician's subtle misdirection, the miller distracted you with conversation, jokes, or even a sudden cough while his fingers did the work. Now, consider the sack itself. You'd think a sack is just a sack, but medieval sacks were made from various materials, some coarser, some finer. Their weave affected how grain settled inside. A looser weave might let smaller bits escape or settle at the bottom, creating the illusion of a heavier load at first glance. You can imagine how a miller who knew his sacks inside out could accidentally use a slightly different sack for certain customers. Lighter, worn sacks meant less grain delivered, but no one thought to weigh the empty bags. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Some millers used what's called the false bottom trick. It sounds like something out of a pirate movie, but yes, a few notoriously crafty millers crafted sack bottoms with hidden compartments. These pockets, cleverly sewn and concealed, could trap a portion of grain, vanishing behind the scenes before you ever got your flour. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just clever rumor fodder, but legal records from 14th century England mention millers caught with sacks too clever for honest folk, sparking fierce debates in local courts. The bigger the sack, the easier it was to pull off such tricks. When you think about it, the whole business of medieval grain measuring was precariously balanced on trust or the lack thereof. Unlike today's strict commercial standards and consumer protections, there were no inspectors with clipboards standing over the miller's shoulder. Mostly, it was a gentleman's agreement backed by communal pressure and occasionally violence, which leads to a quirky but real fact. Millers often carried knives, not just for their own protection against angry peasants, but also to carefully cut open sacks when suspicion arose. A quick slice could reveal if the sack had a false bottom or was double-lined. Some millers, however, were so good at deception that even their own knives couldn't expose their secrets. You might think, well, the villagers should just bring their own scales. But no, scales were expensive and rare, and more importantly, everyone knew the miller had the final say on weight. Bringing your own scale would have been a social insult, a sign you didn't trust the miller or worse, the lord. And social insult in a medieval village? That could be dangerous. One vivid fringe story tells of a miller who was caught red-handed using a wooden scoop carved to hold a third less grain than official standards allowed. The villagers, furious but powerless, decided to teach him a lesson. They replaced his usual wooden scoop with one twice as large, without telling him, and waited for him to serve the next customer. The miller, none the wiser, proceeded to fill sacks well beyond their legal weight, forcing him to deliver more flour than usual. It was a temporary loss, but it sent a message. The miller's pride was bruised, and for weeks afterward, he kept a closer eye on his scoop. This story may be exaggerated, but it highlights the constant tug-of-war over measurement and fairness. Interestingly, the legal systems of the time tried to standardize these measures. Cities and manors issued official measures to prevent outright fraud, but enforcement was patchy. A wooden scoop might be officially stamped or marked, but a miller with a bit of craftiness could modify or substitute it in seconds. Historians still debate whether these official measures ever really curbed miller trickery, or if they just added another layer to the game of hide-and-seek. Some argue that local courts lacked the power or will to enforce penalties, while others believe community pressure kept most millers mostly honest-ish. The stakes were high because grain was a vital currency. A pinch here or there could mean the difference between surviving winter or falling ill from hunger. So the creative measuring wasn't just an annoyance. It was an economic lifeline for millers, many of whom earned barely enough to keep the mill running. At the same time, it sowed deep distrust. You can almost hear the whispered negotiations and side glances. Watch your sack. He's been lightning loads since the harvest moon. And you understand it wasn't just about flour. It was about power. The miller held a position that combined craft, commerce, and a little bit of cunning. He was a necessary villain, spinning flour and stories alike. And now that you know the tricks of the trade, you'll never look at a humble scoop the same way again. You take a step back from the measuring table and let your eyes wander over the complex mechanisms of the mill itself. The rhythmic grinding and groaning of the millstones are more than background noise. They're the heartbeats of this place, setting the pace for every grain of wheat that passes through. But as much as the miller's hands decide how much flour you get, the very machinery also plays its part in the creative game. Imagine the millstones. Two massive, heavy discs made of stone, stacked one atop the other. The upper stone, called the runner, spins against the stationary lower stone, the bedstone. Together, they crush your grain into flour. Simple enough, right? But the devil's in the details. If the stones aren't properly maintained, or deliberately set at a wider gap, they produce coarser flour and leave behind partially ground grain called bran. You're paying for fine flour, but what you actually get is a dusty mix of partially milled husks and broken kernels. It's cheaper to make, and the miller could keep or sell the leftover bran separately. Clever, if morally dubious. The process of dressing the millstones, sharpening and grooving their surfaces, is crucial. Millers prided themselves on this not just for efficiency, but because worn stones meant less flour produced from the same grain. But dressing stones takes time, effort, and skill. So when the harvest was rushed, stones might be left dull, subtly reducing the output and inflating the miller's take. Some historians still argue whether millers often neglected this maintenance deliberately, or if they were simply overwhelmed by demand and lacked the resources to keep everything sharp. After all, it's one thing to cheat with scoops. It's another to keep grinding the village's livelihood to dust. Then there's the water wheel, the giant spinning engine of the mill, turning slowly with the flow of the stream. Its speed directly influences the grinding pace. Too fast, flour heats up and can spoil. Too slow, the grain isn't ground properly and output drops. Skilled millers could subtly adjust the water flow to slow things down or speed them up, controlling how much flour got made and when. In some places, millers were accused of slowing the mill deliberately during peak times to create queues and urgency. People rushed, mistakes happened, and the miller gained room to maneuver the measurements. Plus, longer waits meant less time to check sacks thoroughly. A quirky fact here: some mills had multiple sets of stones, one for coarse meal and one for fine flour. The miller could switch between them, sometimes confusing customers who thought their grain had been ground fine, but was actually coarser meal. This mix-up was often a convenient way to pocket the difference. You can almost hear the miller's chuckle as he flips the lever, switching stones at just the right moment. The mill's layout also contributed to the secrecy. The grinding rooms were often dimly lit, filled with dust that caught the sunlight in shafts, obscuring vision. You couldn't see the measuring or weighing clearly. The miller's counter was typically just a wooden plank with no official scales visible. Any weighing was done behind closed doors or screens, leaving customers guessing. Sometimes even the flour sifting process was suspect. Flour was separated from bran by a series of cloth or horsehair sieves, but the size of the mesh could be altered to favor the miller's bottom line. Finer sieves produced better flour but less byproduct for sale. Coarser sieves produced more bran that could be sold separately or used as cheaper feed. The whole milling operation was an ecosystem of subtle manipulations. And here's a historical fact. In some towns, local authorities eventually mandated inspections of millstones and measuring equipment. Officials would come with their own weights and rulers, checking that the miller's tools complied with regulations. But enforcement varied wildly, and corruption often meant these visits were little more than formalities. You might be picturing some heroic inspectors storming the mill, but in reality, they often took bribes or were related to the miller themselves. After all, everyone knew everyone. On a quirkier note, there's a story from medieval Germany of a miller who allegedly rigged his water wheel to reverse its spin on command, causing flour to fly back into the grain hopper, making the sacks mysteriously fill up again. A kind of medieval flour recycling, if you will. This tale, while almost certainly apocryphal, hints at the folklore and myth that surrounded these mills. Folklore aside, the practical truth was that the physical infrastructure of the mill was ripe for manipulation. It was a machine designed for a complex balance between efficiency, fairness, and secrecy, and often tipped in favor of secrecy. As you stand amidst the dust and the smell of fresh flour, you realize the mill isn't just a building. It's a microcosm of medieval society itself. Part necessity, part theater, part shadowy negotiation. And the miller? He's not just a craftsman but the master of that theater, wielding power not just over grain, but over trust. And trust, you learn, is the most fragile thing of all in a world where bread is life. You watch as the miller's fingers deftly brush flour from the rough edges of the sack, the dust swirling in the slanting sunlight like tiny ghosts of all the grains ever ground here. But the flour itself? It's not just about how much you get, it's about what you get. And that's where the miller's creative measuring wasn't just a numbers game. It was an exercise in quality control medieval style. The grain you bring to the mill varies wildly, from plump, well-ripened kernels to broken, immature bits. The miller's job isn't just to grind but to sort and separate, ensuring the flour is consistent enough to bake bread that won't choke your family or give your wife a nasty stomachache. But separating good grain from bad also offered an opportunity to stretch the profits, by tossing aside or quietly pocketing the less desirable bits. You can imagine the miller standing over a heap of grain, sifting through the chaff and tiny stones mixed in by careless harvesters, deciding what to grind and what to discard. It's a bit like playing judge, jury, and executioner, only the death sentence here is a sack of discarded kernels. Historians still argue whether this sorting was a necessary part of the process or just another avenue for millers to cheat. Some say it was essential for flour quality, while others see it as a convenient excuse for thinning out sacks. Interestingly, some mills had a system called grist separation. The grain was ground once, but then the coarser bran and leftover bits were sieved out and sometimes sold separately as middlings or animal feed. This extra step was a way to maximize value from every bushel. But the dark side was that millers could exaggerate the amount of middlings, reducing the amount of fine flour delivered to you. Sometimes, these middlings were passed off as flour to unsuspecting customers, especially in poorer villages. Quirky fact alert: in some regions, it was said that millers would sprinkle small amounts of water on grain before grinding, making it heavier but harder to grind properly. This wet grain would slow down the millstones, reducing output and giving the miller more room to maneuver the measures. Now, this might sound counterproductive. Why add water and make the grinding harder? But it was a clever way to create delays, justify lower yields, and increase the total grain charged. On the quality front, there were occasional rumors that millers would salt their flour, adding a pinch of salt to make the flour appear more voluminous or better quality. While no serious historian has confirmed this as common practice, the tale persisted, probably as a reflection of the widespread suspicion surrounding the profession. The truth is, the miller's role blurred lines between craftsman and merchant, with a heavy dose of opportunist. And because most medieval customers had little knowledge of milling themselves, the miller's word on quality often went unchallenged. You might think, well, I'll just check the flour when I get home. But the differences between flour grades weren't always obvious, especially after baking. You might end up with bread that's denser or coarser than usual, or with a slightly different color. Subtle, but over time people noticed. This quality control, or lack thereof, fed the stereotype of the miller as a cheat and a trickster. But it also gave rise to a strange respect. After all, the miller had to understand grain intimately, anticipate problems, and manage unpredictable machinery. and he had to live with the suspicion of everyone who depended on him. A fascinating bit of history. In some medieval guilds, millers were required to swear oaths to uphold fairness in their measures and quality. These oaths were taken seriously, sometimes in front of the village priest or magistrate, with penalties including fines, loss of license, or even public shaming. Yet, enforcement was spotty and temptation high. There's a charmingly odd story from 13th century France about a miller caught cheating who was forced to wear a sack of grain around his neck for a day as punishment, walking through the village while everyone threw stale bread at him. It was a mix of humiliation and community justice, but also a sign of how public these disputes could become. Despite all this, you get the sense the miller's creative quality control wasn't just about greed. It was also about navigating a system that often squeezed his margins and kept him on edge. He balanced loyalty to the Lord, obligations to the village, and the harsh realities of medieval economics. So, next time you bite into crusty bread, remember the miller's dance. Not just the quantity, but the invisible balancing act of quality and trust. You step closer to the heart of the village now, where the social fabric tangles tightly with the miller's role. Because in medieval times, the miller wasn't just a grinder of grain. He was a vital, if sometimes begrudged, part of the community's everyday life. His creative measuring had social consequences that rippled far beyond sacks of flour. You might imagine the miller as a solitary figure in a dusty workshop, but the reality was much more intertwined. The miller lived in the village or just outside it, mingling in markets, festivals, and church services. Everyone knew his reputation, whether it was one of cunning or generosity. Villagers often had complicated feelings about the miller. Sure, he could cheat you with a light measure, but he was also the one who saved you from hunger. Without his mill, your grain was worthless. No bread, no beer, no porridge. You depended on him, but you also kept a wary eye. One fascinating aspect is how millers used social bonds to their advantage. They often had favored customers, neighbors, or friends who received fairer treatment. These alliances were essential, especially during tough times when scarcity made every grain precious. Sometimes the miller would extend credit or offer a better measure to those he liked or who promised future loyalty. Other villagers, less fortunate or less connected, might end up with lighter sacks. Historians still argue whether this favoritism was an unavoidable part of rural life or an abuse of power. Some see it as a form of social glue, others as a source of resentment and conflict. The miller's social status was ambiguous, too. He was usually not a lord or noble, but neither was he just a common peasant. The job required specialized knowledge and control of valuable property. The mill itself, so millers often enjoyed privileges like exemption from certain taxes or rights to collect multure, a fee paid in grain. Yet, this privilege also made millers targets for suspicion and blame. Folk tales and literature from the period often portray millers as greedy, sly, or even in league with the devil. You might remember the caricature of the miller in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, boasting about his strength but also his tricky ways. In some villages, the miller's role was so loaded with ambivalence that he could be both respected and reviled in the same breath. And then there were the disputes. Feuds over grain measures, weights, and payments were common. Villagers might band together to confront the miller if they suspected foul play, sometimes resorting to violence or legal action. In some cases, Entire communities petitioned their lords to remove dishonest millers. You get the picture. This wasn't a quiet job. A quirky historical nugget. In certain German regions, millers wore distinctive hats or badges as a sign of their trade. But during festivals, villagers would sometimes prank the miller by stealing or switching his hat. A light-hearted way to keep the powerful miller humble. It's a reminder that millers walked a tightrope, balancing authority with approachability. Legal frameworks tried to regulate the relationship between miller and village. Contracts and charters often outlined how much grain the miller could claim, how measures were to be standardized, and what penalties applied for cheating. Still, enforcement depended heavily on local power dynamics. If the miller had strong backing from the lord or church, villagers had little recourse. In other cases, a particularly cunning or popular miller could withstand accusations thanks to social support. You might be wondering, what about the lord? The miller wasn't just a village employee. He was often a tenant or agent of the manor lord, who collected a portion of the grain as rent or tax. This connection added a layer of complexity. The lord wanted steady income, the miller wanted to maximize profits, and the villagers wanted fair treatment. Sometimes the lord sided with the miller, sometimes with the villagers, sometimes neither. Historians still debate how these competing interests shaped milling practices and fairness. Did lords actively encourage miller cheating to boost revenue, or did they try to protect peasants from exploitation? The answer likely varied from place to place. One interesting detail: in some places, the lord might own the mill outright but lease it to a miller for a fixed fee. This arrangement incentivized the miller to creatively measure grain to boost his profits beyond the rent. It's a cycle of economics, trust, and tension. And as the village bustled outside, with children chasing chickens and merchants calling their wares, the miller's world was this blend of shadows and light, trust and suspicion. You see now that his creative grain measuring wasn't just a trick. It was a social dance, a delicate balance woven into the very fabric of medieval life. You follow the trail of flour dust from the mill to the markets where it becomes the lifeblood of daily trade and barter. This is where the miller's creative grain measuring truly reveals its broader impact, reaching beyond village boundaries into bustling town squares and regional commerce. At the market, sacks of flour are stacked high, traders shouting prices, merchants scrutinizing weights, and buyers, mostly women, haggling over every last grain. You see the miller's work transformed into currency, both literal and figurative. Every grain measured creatively back at the mill affects what's on these tables. Medieval markets were vibrant yet chaotic affairs. Standardized measures were supposed to govern transactions, but in reality, every town had its quirks. Some towns enforced strict weighing rules with official measures stamped by local authorities. Others operated on trust and reputation. In places with rigorous oversight, the miller's creative measuring was less tolerated, at least in theory. But where official measures were weak or enforcement lax, crafty millers found fertile ground for their subtle manipulations. Traders often used large, standardized weights, like heavy bronze or iron bars marked with town seals. Still, much of the actual measuring was done with wooden scoops or cloth sacks, tools easily altered to cheat the system. You might be surprised to learn that wooden measures were often deliberately carved to hold less grain than their official size suggested, a practice called short measure. Some millers even had secret measures, smaller scoops hidden away, swapped in during busy market days when no one was watching closely. And here's a quirky fact. In 14th century England, a particular law banned the use of false measures under penalty of fines or imprisonment, but rather than eradicate cheating, it pushed it underground. Millers and merchants developed elaborate signals and rituals to hide their tricks, such as tapping a scoop twice before filling or folding a cloth sack in a special way to disguise its true capacity. Historians still argue whether such laws were effective deterrents or simply window dressing for a system that depended on subtle fraud to function. The grain trade was also influenced by seasons and harvest cycles. After a poor harvest, flour prices soared, and the temptation to cheat increased. Villagers and town dwellers alike grew more suspicious, leading to market disputes and sometimes violent confrontations. It wasn't uncommon for buyers to demand open sacks, wanting to see and feel the flour inside. Yet, millers and merchants resisted. Flour dust and light could make sacks appear fuller than they actually were. Clever visual illusions were part of the game. In a fascinating anecdote, a 15th century market inspector in France reportedly carried a trained ferret to sniff out flour that had been stretched with chalk or other adulterants. While that might sound like a fairy tale, it reflects the lengths people went to in order to detect fraud. Flour adulteration, mixing pure flour with cheaper substances, was another layer of the miller's creative measuring. Chalk, powdered bones, or even ground nutshells were sometimes added to increase volume. Not exactly the wholesome bread you'd imagine, but a common practice. As you wander the market's chaos, you notice the keen eyes of buyers, especially women who often did the cooking. They developed subtle tests, like sprinkling flour on water or feeling the texture to detect poor quality or hidden fillers. The miller's reputation here was a fragile thing, built over time but easily shattered by a bad batch or a heavy-handed cheat. You can see how market pressures influenced the miller's behavior back at the mill. If word got out that he short-measured sacks or adulterated flour, customers might stop bringing grain to his mill or worse, take legal action. Speaking of legal action, medieval courts often dealt with disputes over grain quality and weight. Cases could drag on for months, with testimonies from expert bakers, millers, and traders. Evidence was tricky. How do you prove a sack was short when everyone has a different memory of the measure? Historians still debate how much these legal disputes actually curbed cheating versus just raising the stakes in a game that everyone knew was rigged to some extent. A fun side note, some towns had special measure museums where official weights and measures were displayed for public reference. This was part transparency, part public shaming. If your local miller's measures didn't match these standards, villagers had some ammunition. But in the end, trust was a currency as important as gold or grain. The miller's art was not just in grinding but in maintaining that trust, by whatever means necessary. So as you watch the market crowd swirl around sacks of flour, you realize the miller's creative grain measuring was part economics, part performance, and part social contract. And that, in a dusty market stall or a quiet village mill, was how the medieval world turned its grain into bread and its trust into currency. You follow the flour from the bustling markets into the warm, smoky kitchens where it's transformed into the staple of medieval life, bread. Here, the miller's creative grain measuring subtly shapes the most fundamental element of daily survival and culture. Picture a medieval hearth, a low stone oven glowing red, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and yeast. You watch as the baker, often a village woman, needs dough made from flour that's just a little lighter, a little coarser than expected. That difference might seem small, but over weeks and months, it adds up to hunger, frustration, and whispered complaints. Bread was life. It was fuel for work, a symbol of hospitality, and sometimes even a form of currency. Poor quality flour or smaller quantities meant less bread, less nourishment, and sometimes malnutrition. So the miller's creative measuring wasn't just a financial trick, it had real consequences. You might think the baker could compensate by adding more water or yeast, but it's not that simple. Flour's quality determines texture, rise, and shelf life. Flour adulterated with bran or middlings produced dense, crumbly bread that spoiled quickly. Over time, this affected health and morale. Historians still argue how much blame for poor bread quality belongs to the miller versus the baker. Some say bakers often lacked skill or resources. Others point squarely at the miller's flour. Baking was also tied to religious and social customs. Bread was offered at church, shared at festivals, and even used as gifts. A miller who shortchanged flour wasn't just cheating money. He was affecting social rituals and community bonds. A quirky tidbit: in parts of medieval Europe, bakers and millers belonged to the same guild or cooperative, blending cooperation with competition. Guilds regulated quality, set prices, and even held joint oaths to uphold fairness. But internal disputes were common, too. Sometimes bakers accused millers of delivering poor flour. Millers blamed bakers for bad bread. It was a classic blame game, but it shows the interdependence of these trades. Bread shortages could spark unrest. In some towns, riots erupted over poor flour quality or price hikes blamed on millers. You can imagine angry villagers banging on mill doors, demanding justice or worse. One famous incident from 14th century England saw a mob storm a miller's home after repeated complaints about light measures. The miller escaped only by fleeing to the local lord's protection. It was a stark reminder of the miller's precarious position, powerful but vulnerable. On a lighter note, medieval bakers sometimes added herbs or honey to mask the taste of poorer flour, a bit like a culinary patch job. This didn't solve the underlying problem, but it kept the bread edible and the family fed. You might also find it fascinating that some medieval recipes included instructions for testing flour quality, such as sprinkling it on water to see if it floated, indicating lightness, or felt gritty, a sign of bran contamination. The whole baking process was a delicate balance of art, science, and survival, with the miller's flour quality a critical ingredient. And you realize that the miller's creative grain measuring rippled through this intimate process, influencing the texture of daily life and the very bread that filled tables across medieval Europe. As you watch the baker pull a warm loaf from the oven, golden and crusty, you appreciate the invisible hand of the miller, the unseen partner in this age-old ritual of breaking bread. It's a reminder that every bite carries a story, sometimes grainy, sometimes sweet, always layered with history. You slip away from the warmth of the baker's oven and step into the shadowy world of medieval law, where the miller's creative grain measuring often met its reckoning. Here, fairness wasn't just a moral ideal, it was a legal battleground. Imagine a crowded village hall, wooden benches packed with farmers, millers, and the local lord's steward. Disputes over grain measures were serious business, capable of igniting tension that could disrupt the fragile balance of rural life. You sit in the back, hearing the miller's measured words as he defends his practices against suspicious neighbors. In medieval Europe, laws regulating weights and measures date back to the early Middle Ages, but enforcement was patchy. Lords, churches, and town councils often issued detailed statutes prescribing exact sizes for bushels, sacks, and scoops. Yet, the power to enforce these laws varied widely depending on local politics and economics. You discover that court cases concerning grain measures frequently hinged on testimony from witnesses who themselves had imperfect memories or vested interests. It's like a medieval episode of a courtroom drama, with accusations, denials, and sometimes bribery. Historians still debate whether legal systems effectively curbed millers' cheating or merely legitimized it under certain conditions. Some argue the law was a tool of control for lords, ensuring steady revenue even if peasants suffered. One curious legal detail: in some regions, millers had to publicly display their measuring tools for inspection during market days or festivals. Refusal or failure to comply could lead to fines or temporary loss of milling rights. But there were also more unusual punishments for cheating. In England, a miller caught short measuring might have to carry a heavy sack of grain through the village in a humiliating parade. A vivid reminder of communal justice. You learn that such punishments weren't only about fairness but about maintaining trust. The miller's role was too crucial for villages to let dishonesty spiral out of control. A quirky legal tidbit: medieval legal codes sometimes required millers to take an oath on the Bible, swearing to use honest measures. Breaking this oath risked excommunication or social ostracism, powerful deterrents in deeply religious communities. But oaths weren't always enough. Some millers secretly colluded with local officials or used counterfeit seals on their measures, making detection tricky. The most famous legal case involving a miller's cheating comes from 14th century France, where a miller was fined for using a smaller-than-standard peck measure, but cleverly argued that local custom justified his actions. The court accepted his defense, highlighting the tension between official law and local practice. It's a reminder that medieval law wasn't a monolith but a patchwork of customs, statutes, and power plays. You also hear about measuremen, local officials appointed to inspect mills and markets regularly. Their job was to check weights and measures and to catch cheats. But these inspectors were often poorly paid, susceptible to bribes, or pressured by influential millers. In some villages, you get the sense that the inspector was part of the miller's social circle, which complicated impartiality. This interplay between law, enforcement, and social dynamics shaped how creative grain measuring evolved. The miller had to navigate not only the mechanics of milling and measuring, but also the politics of justice. You can almost hear the murmurs in that village hall, the sharp eyes of neighbors watching every grain weighed, every sack filled, weighing more than just flour. It's about trust, power, and survival. So, in the quiet adjudications of medieval courts, the story of the miller's creativity unfolds as a reflection of broader struggles. Fairness versus survival, law versus custom, community versus individual. It's a tale as old as time, told in the language of grain and justice. You drift from the courtroom's tense atmosphere into the quiet yet industrious world of mill technology, where wooden gears, stone wheels, and ingenious mechanical designs played a starring role in the miller's ability to pull off his creative grain measuring. Standing beside a massive water wheel slowly turning in a river's steady flow, you feel the raw power harnessed to crush grain into flour. It's a marvel of medieval engineering, simple yet effective, with every cog and will carefully crafted to convert nature's energy into human use. This technology wasn't static. Over centuries, mills evolved with improvements in water wheel design, gearing mechanisms, and stone dressing, the grinding surface, all of which influenced the fineness of flour and the efficiency of the milling process. You might find it surprising that millers had to be part engineer, part technician, constantly adjusting their equipment to suit different grains, seasonal moisture levels, and demand. One fascinating technical fact: millstones were often dressed or patterned with grooves in specific ways to channel grain and optimize grinding. This patterning affected not only flour quality but also the volume produced, giving millers another subtle means to tweak output. Historians still argue how much these technical details were manipulated for profit versus simply responding to practical needs like wear and tear. Beyond watermills, windmills emerged in parts of Europe by the 12th century, especially in flatter regions like the Netherlands and England. These wind-powered mills offered greater flexibility but also required millers to master complex mechanisms controlling the sails and gears. You discover that millers' skills included not just operation but also maintenance, replacing worn stones, sharpening gears, and managing water flow. This technical mastery gave them a certain authority and status in the community. And here's a quirky tidbit. Millers often kept pet animals like cats or dogs to protect the mill from rodents or thieves. One English miller's account mentions a prized ferret trained to chase away vermin that threatened grain stores. A charming example of medieval pest control. The physical layout of mills also influenced grain measuring. Many mills had separate chutes and hoppers, sometimes designed to accidentally divert part of the grain away from official measures. Clever positioning of these parts could alter the weight of flour produced without obvious signs. You see that the technology and the miller's craft were tightly intertwined, enabling both efficient production and subtle creative measurement. Medieval mills also faced challenges from nature. Floods, droughts, and mechanical breakdowns could halt production. The miller had to balance technical skill with adaptability and sometimes improvisation. There's also evidence that some millers secretly altered their stones dressings or adjusted water flow to increase speed and volume, thereby increasing profits but risking wear and decreased flour quality. Historians debate how widespread these technical cheats were, as surviving records are sparse and much knowledge was passed down orally or kept secret. From a broader perspective, the evolution of milling technology reflected economic and social shifts. As towns grew and trade expanded, the demand for reliable, standardized flour increased, pressuring millers to adopt innovations while keeping their profit margins. And you realize the miller's creative grain measuring was often as much about mastering machinery as manipulating measurements, a dance of technology and human cunning. The mill was a place where raw nature met human ingenuity, and in that space, the miller's skill was as much mechanical as social. So, as you watch the slow, steady turning of the millstones, you understand that every grain measured was the product of centuries of craft, technology, and a touch of slyness. You leave the mill's mechanical heart behind and step into the delicate, shadowy realm of grain storage and preservation, where the miller's creative measuring extended its influence in subtle but significant ways. Here, in dim granaries and dusty barns, the battle for quality and quantity took a new form. Imagine a cool, musty granary filled with towering sacks and wooden bins, the faint aroma of damp straw mixing with grain dust. You realize that how grain and flour were stored affected not only the food supply but also the miller's profits and the honesty of his measures. Grain was vulnerable to pests, moisture, and spoilage. Millers and farmers alike had to protect their stock from rats, weevils, and mold. Storage containers ranged from simple woven sacks to elaborate wooden silos with ventilation systems. In some villages, the miller was responsible for storing grain on behalf of customers. This gave him access and opportunity to adjust quantities, whether by pilfering small amounts or by shifting grain between containers to disguise short measures. You might be surprised to learn that medieval storage bins were often designed with small gaps or hidden compartments, sometimes intentionally, to facilitate creative redistribution of grain, though this varied widely. Historians still debate how common these storage manipulations were, as physical evidence is scarce and much was deliberately concealed. Humidity was another challenge. Damp grain could spoil or ferment, turning into worthless mush or even toxic fodder. Some millers added drying steps or blended fresher grain with older stocks, which could change the flour's weight and quality. And here's a quirky detail. Medieval grain stores sometimes included grain guardians, like cats or trained birds, to keep pests away. Some mills even had small shrines or charms hung in granaries to protect the harvest, part superstition, part folk science. Storage losses were called the miller's toll in some regions, a euphemism for both spoilage and deliberate shortchanging. This phrase hints at the fine line millers walked between accepted practice and outright theft. In times of famine or war, granaries became strategic assets. Lords might seize stored grain for armies or redistribute it to prevent starvation. This politicized storage practices and increased scrutiny on millers' accounts. You learn that some millers kept detailed ledgers, recording grain in and out, but many did not, creating gaps that allowed for creative measurement and occasional fraud. In an intriguing twist, some communities practiced community granaries, where grain was pooled and managed collectively. This system aimed to reduce cheating but introduced its own complexities and disputes. The miller's role as grain custodian was thus both technical and political, responsible for safeguarding vital resources but tempted by opportunities to skim. You realize how the seemingly simple act of storing grain was deeply entwined with trust, power, and survival, and how creative measuring at this stage could ripple through entire communities. It's a reminder that every grain counted, not just when ground at the mill or sold at market, but through the entire journey from field to table. And so, as you stand among those silent sacks and creaking bins, you grasp the hidden world where the miller's craft, cunning, and circumstance intertwined in the shadows. You leave the quiet granary behind and step into the lively rhythm of rural festivals and communal events where bread, and by extension, the miller's flour, played a symbolic role, revealing yet another dimension of creative grain measuring. Imagine a sunlit village green crowded with families, colorful banners fluttering in the breeze, the sound of fiddles and drums mingling with laughter. The centerpiece? A communal loaf or cakes baked from the miller's flour, shared among all. These festivals were about more than celebration. They were moments when the miller's honesty was on public display. Bread was central to medieval rituals. Harvest festivals, weddings, religious holidays. The size, quality, and distribution of bread reflected social order and trust. A loaf too small, a crumbly texture. These were subtle signals of the miller's reliability. In many communities, The miller was expected to contribute flour or bread to church offerings or feasts. Failing to provide fair quantities risked social scorn or worse. Historians still debate how much these social expectations restrained millers from cheating versus encouraging them to find ways to meet obligations without losing profit. At some festivals, bread-throwing contests or baking competitions were popular, blending fun with subtle tests of flour quality. You might find it amusing that some events rewarded the heaviest loaf, prompting bakers and millers to collaborate on creative recipes that stretched flour while keeping loaves impressive. A quirky tradition in parts of medieval England involved the barm cake, a small, yeasted bread given to poor villagers during festivals. Millers who short-measured flour risked failing these charitable duties, damaging their reputation. You also learn that bread was used symbolically in contracts and oaths. Breaking bread signified trust and agreement. A miller who cheated on flour could jeopardize community bonds on a deeply personal level. On a lighter note, some medieval festivals featured millers' dances or pageants celebrating the milling craft, complete with costumes and playful skits. These events helped humanize the miller's role and perhaps softened criticism of their creative measuring. You hear stories of millers using festival days as opportunities to reset debts or settle disputes through gifts of flour or bread, weaving economic and social functions together. The miller's public role during these communal moments was complex, both as a provider and a figure whose integrity was constantly tested. You see how the social fabric depended on more than laws and markets. It relied on shared rituals that held communities together. Yet, the miller's creativity in measuring sometimes blurred lines between generosity and exploitation, especially when flour was scarce. You reflect on how these festivals and traditions shaped perceptions of fairness, trust, and survival in medieval life. And as the music fades and the last crumbs of bread are shared, you understand that the miller's story is not just about grain or profit, but about belonging and the delicate balance of community. In this dance of flour and festivity, the miller's craft was both a source of sustenance and a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and values of an age-long past. You step away from the bustle of village festivals and find yourself in the quiet realm of miller folklore and superstition, where tales and rumors swirl around these grain merchants, blending truth and myth in a way that reveals how deeply their creative grain measuring penetrated popular imagination. Picture a flickering hearth in a dark medieval tavern. Locals gather, exchanging stories in low voices, their faces lit by the fire's glow. The miller, always a figure of suspicion and fascination, appears in these tales as part trickster, part magician, part victim of fate. Folklore paints millers as slippery characters, sometimes downright crafty, sometimes cursed by their own greed. One common motif is the miller's thumb, the idea that millers used a crooked thumb or special grip to cheat when measuring grain or flour. This superstition likely arose from real practices but quickly morphed into legend. You might be amused to learn that in some regions, people believed a miller's touch could curse bread, causing it to spoil or bring bad luck, a belief that reveals the miller's ambiguous social standing. Historians still debate how much these stories reflected actual miller behavior versus popular fears and stereotypes, but they certainly show how central millers were in the medieval psyche. Another quirky tale involves the Devil's Mill, a cursed or haunted mill where strange noises, broken machinery, or bad harvests were blamed on supernatural interference, often linked to the miller's moral failings or greed. You find that these legends served to enforce social norms indirectly, warning millers against dishonesty and reminding communities of the fragile balance between trust and betrayal. In some folk songs, millers are depicted as romantic heroes or comic rogues, sometimes both, reflecting their complex reputation. You also discover rituals designed to protect mills from evil or ensure honest milling, such as hanging charms or offering prayers before starting work. The symbolic power of the miller extended beyond their trade into broader cultural beliefs about fate, justice, and the unseen forces shaping daily life. One particularly strange superstition from Northern Europe held that millers' wives wore special gloves to prevent their husbands from using magical tricks during measuring. A fascinating mix of practical suspicion and mystical fear. You see how millers existed in a liminal space, not quite trusted, not quite shunned, where their actions were scrutinized both in court and in stories. These tales reveal a world where grain measuring wasn't just a matter of economics but a theater of social drama, suspicion, and folklore. You realize the miller's creative grain measuring was as much about perception as practice, shaping their legacy in the collective memory. And as the tavern's fire dies down, leaving shadows and whispers, you carry with you the knowledge that millers were woven deeply into the stories people told to make sense of fairness, survival, and the unknown. You drift from the flickering tavern firelight to the bustling marketplace, where trade and commerce bring the miller's craft into sharp relief amid the clatter of carts and bargaining voices. This is where the creative grain measuring often played out in the messy realities of medieval economics. Picture a lively market square, stalls piled high with sacks of grain, baskets of flour, and freshly baked bread. Buyers and sellers shout prices, wave coins, and eyeball measures with suspicion. The miller stands nearby, juggling orders and eyeing customers, aware that reputation and profit hang in the balance. Markets were the front line of economic exchange, and standardizing weights and measures was a constant struggle. Official standards were set by town authorities or guilds, but enforcement was uneven, especially in rural areas. You learn that millers often relied on secret measures, small containers hidden inside official scoops or slyly swapped when no one was watching. This wasn't always outright fraud. Sometimes it was a necessary survival tactic in a world of fluctuating grain supplies and unpredictable harvests. Historians still argue how widespread such practices were versus how much competition and social pressure kept millers honest. An amusing market fact: in some towns, buyers would bring their own weights or containers to check millers' measures, sort of an early version of consumer protection, albeit not always friendly. Market fairs, held annually or seasonally, attracted merchants from afar, increasing the pressure on millers to appear reliable. But long-distance buyers had less recourse if cheated, allowing some millers to be more creative out of sight. You discover that millers sometimes formed alliances or cartels to fix prices or control grain flow, influencing not just local markets but regional trade as well. This echoes modern concerns about monopolies and price fixing. A quirky detail: some medieval markets had measure masters, appointed to inspect scales and measures regularly. Failure to comply could mean hefty fines or public shaming, often enforced by humiliating rituals like wearing a sign proclaiming dishonesty. The interplay of market forces, regulation, and social norms created a complex ecosystem where millers balanced risk, profit, and community relations. You also find records of disputes between millers and bakers over flour quality and quantity, revealing a delicate supply chain where trust was essential but sometimes in short supply. Markets were a place where the miller's creative grain measuring could either make or break reputations, livelihoods, and local economies. And as the sun sets on the noisy market square, you feel the pulse of medieval commerce, a world alive with negotiation, cunning, and the eternal tension between fairness and profit. The miller's craft, grounded in ancient technology but sharpened by social dynamics, unfolds here in full complexity. You sense that the story of creative grain measuring is ultimately a story about human nature, our drive to survive, to thrive, and sometimes to bend the rules.